Hello and welcome back to Beaver Hunter's Game Models. This time it's all about how I built and painted the diorama for the figures I painted in the last video. You might know this scene from an historical photo from Normandy in World War II, which inspired me to this build, and if you want to know how it was done, please stay tuned. This was my starting point, a resin casting kit which includes the famous Café Philippe I want to recreate for this scene. And because the size was way too big for my 6 figures project, I decided I will cut it into a smaller, more suitable size, which I tested with the wooden sticks here. When I was happy with the dimensions, I marked them on the base and cut it with a saw in my garage, because I wanted to avoid having that toxic resin dust in my hobby room. To increase the base a bit and give it more volume, I cut 2 pieces of styrofoam with my hot wire cutter in the required size. Test fitted them with the resin piece and used wood glue to glue them together. To increase the pressure on the glue while drying, I made some good use of my World War II literature. When the glue dried, I framed the piece with wooden veneer attached with wood glue and fixed it in place with metal pins so it doesn't move. I also wrapped some masking tape around it so the edges are pressed together tightly. I tried using double-sided tape for this in the past, but I was never satisfied with it because the frame always came loose after some time, so I stick to the wood glue approach here. While the frame was drying, I took care of the next step. Because this kit is a resin casting, there were countless small air bubbles in the surface of the cobblestones, and I closed them using Bergswerk's ultraleichter Modellbau Spachtel, which applied with a wet sponge, so it doesn't cover the whole surface, but only fills the small bubbles. Then I could remove the pins and masking tape because the frame had dried in the meantime. Cut off the protruding edges flush and with a sanding sponge smoothen these out. With a new sharp blade in my hobby knife, I cut the upper part of the frame flush to the surface of the scene. The huge gaps on the sides were because the original base wasn't in a 90-degree angle, and I balanced this out with the foam and the wooden frame. I then filled the holes from the pins and the edges with the spatula from Bergswerk and sanded it smooth again. The ground wasn't looking that bad in its original form, but I wanted to push it a little further. And for some more texture and interest, I applied Vallejo's earth texture on top of it. This was then smoothened out a bit with a water moistened brush so it's not too thick and building up, bringing the ground higher than necessary. And this was a good point to fill the gaps and integrate the frame into the scene. To bring some more texture to the ground and for more variation, I randomly placed real earth without a trademark on the dried earth paste and spreaded it over the whole ground, but without covering it completely, so it's not building up too much. And I used AK's dried seagrass, which I also applied randomly over the base to add some weeds and grass remnants from the last summer winds. This also helps to break up the monotone looking ground texture and add some variation too. I then flooded the whole ground with alcohol to break the surface tension. And then used with water diluted wood glue to fix the earth and seagrass in place. With a soft big brush, I then pushed the wood glue around and prevented it from pooling in the deeper spots and made sure that every bit of earth would be secured with the glue. In the back area of the diorama was some space for vegetation, and I started with placing random blobs of undiluted wood glue with a medium-sized brush. And with my static res applicator, which is working worse or better depending on its mood, I loaded some static res on the glue blobs and removed the axis by turning it upside down. With sanitary hemp, which I placed into the static res and around the building's position, I added some longer tufts, and this helped to bring some volume and wilderness into the grass. These model railway products are perfect to add some low growing plants into the area and make this corner look like it grew wildly and undisturbed, and it also adds some variation to the grass. And that's it for the base for now, and I went to the building's roof next. I saw on a reference picture that the original building had at least one dormer on the roof during wartime, but this wasn't included in the kit, so I built me one from scratch. And for that I cut the basic shape from styrofoam and test fitted it onto the roof. When I was satisfied, I cut an opening for the window and then glued it onto the resin roof with wood glue. The roof from the kit was slightly wider than the building itself, and I was fortunate enough that the rest piece I removed fitted the dormer perfectly, so I glued it on top and had a matching roof here. From the reference picture it looked to me as the sides of the dormer were clad with slate shingles. So I cut some random shingles from very thin styrofoam stripes I cut from rest pieces with my hot wire cutter, and started to glue them in place piece by piece. This might look boring, but it was actually very relaxing. When the glue had dried, I removed the protruding edges of the shingles from the front and then brushed diluted wood glue over the whole foam area to make it a bit stronger, seal it so it's not soaking up the paint later, and fix the shingles in place forever. I covered the transitions to the roof with pieces I cut from copper foil, so it's at least looking like it could be rainproof. The foil is 0.1 mm thick and perfect for jobs like these, because it's very soft and can be brought in almost every shape. And I hope it will be doing okay with some paint on it. I then quickly finished the front with Bergswerk spatula to imply a plaster surface. And here I used a silicone brush to create a smooth surface, and then used a stiff brush with some water to create an uneven plaster-like look. For the window I used a 3D print, and with a test piece I checked the fit and worked the opening into the desired shape and size. I want to keep it removable for later painting. And with that the roof was done for now, and I went on to the facade. I here started with building the frame of the cafe sign from wooden sticks which were included in the set. The sign is maybe the most important piece to recognize the building, and I wasn't completely sure at this point how I would create it. Would it be painted by hand, airbrushed, or with a 3D print? The frame for the large window was missing too, and I also made it from wooden sticks which were included in the set. This job was a bit tricky to make it symmetrical and right angled, but with some patience I think I got it done okay. I then again went over it with diluted wood glue to strengthen the bond and make it more durable. To add some wear and tear to the frame and make it look less brand new, I used my hobby knife and a handsaw and made the edges round and irregular and created some smaller crevices into the wood. And with Bergswerk spatula I then filled the gaps between the frame and the back of the sign, because I still wasn't sure at this point if I will paint the sign. And with that I had an even surface and it looked like one piece. Also visible on the reference picture is an angle steel with an electric junction and some wires, and to recreate this I drilled a hole in the facade and glued some styrene angle steel from evergreen into it. I then glued an electric junction I 3D printed on top of it, and with 0.3 copper wire I then laid the wires like I saw them running in the picture. To fill the drilling hole and integrate the angle steel into the facade, I used Vallejo's earth texture again to imply some plaster texture in that area and smooth it out a bit with a water moistened brush. In the meantime I decided on a 3D print for the cafe sign. It's just too important for the building's recognition value to mess it up with a freehand painting. So I designed and printed it and then glued it into the frame. And after filling the gaps with Bergswerk spatula again, I was satisfied with my solution. The plastered areas of the facade were looking pretty nice, but were lacking texture and too smooth. So I again used the all-rounder spatula by Bergswerk and applied it with a stippling motion onto these areas. And after it dried I smoothed it out a bit with sanding, so protruding pimples were removed and the facade had a nice and clean look. Then I had to take care of a problem that bothered me from the beginning. I wanted to fill the building with styrofoam to give it more volume and have a clean backside as a finish to the frame. But I also wanted to keep the facade removable for better painting, and to add some clear plastic as window glass afterwards. So I placed the facade on the base and cut some styrofoam pieces into the matching sides. After marking the windows positions and gluing the pieces together, I cut out the openings generously and then glued the corpus onto the base. Next I glued the roof in its position temporarily with a few drops of superglue to see the dimensions of the building. I then could fill up the rest of the building as the foam pieces I had left at home weren't big enough to fill the whole facade directly. And then again I framed it with balsa wood, so it was no real problem using the small foam pieces a moment before. The protruding edges of the roof were marked and sawed off so it's matching the frame. And as the corpus and backside are done now, I could glue the roof in place permanently. And like that I was rewarded with a removable facade, which I can now paint easily and then add the window glass before gluing it in place forever. The backside was filled with spatula and sanded again, and it's not a bad thing that it won't be visible a lot later, as I am clearly no spatula ninja. With that out of the way, I could add final details like this rain gutter. It wasn't included in the kit, so I had to print it again, and as I couldn't find a matching STL for this length, I used 3 prints which I combined using a saw and superglue to one matching piece. The adhesive joints were supported with some wood pieces and hidden under some putty texture on the outside and some real earth inside the gutter, which gives the impression of dirt accumulating in the gutter over some time. And some seagrass comes in handy too. And after pushing it around a bit, I fixed it in place with VMS sand and ballistries. The small walls in front of the building were finished with some rubble in the box by Juvila, as the kit's parts were too bulky for my taste, and like that I also came closer to the reference again. And with real earth I closed the gaps in the rubble and gave it a smoother finish. And this was then again fixed in place with the VMS stuff. As in the background of the picture visible, there were some kind of trees, so I had to build one. I therefore got me a small twig for my garden and started to glue seafoam twigs onto it. I herefore used Bergwerk's ultra-fast CA and built up my scratch build tree like this, placing the seafoam where I felt it would make sense and look good. And at certain places it was helpful to first drill a small hole into the tree before gluing the seafoam into it. When I was happy with my little tree, I marked the center point and drilled a hole into the tree and the base where it would be placed. And then glued a shortened toothpick into it, and with that could place it temporarily onto the base and have a better connection when I want to glue it in place after painting. To finish it, I again used the earth paste to strengthen the connection points and smoothen them out, especially where the wider tree continued as foam twigs. And again I used a moistened brush to smoothen the paste. And with that the building stage was completed and the diorama ready for some paint. And in good tradition it took me longer than expected to finish building it. The backside, like I said before, is no masterpiece, but it will do. And when the facade will be glued in place, I will then close the last remaining gaps. This is a compromise I will take for the comfort of better painting. As always, the painting stage is started with a good cleaning to get rid of dust from sanding and sawing, grease from my fingers and general dirt. Especially the smooth resin parts were concerning me and I wanted a good foundation for the paint to adhere here well. The first primer used was Tamiya's metal primer, which I applied on all metal parts. In this case only the copper wires and the foil on the roof. This stuff is really helpful for the paint to adhere on the metal parts and can also be applied by airbrush on smaller PE parts, for example. The second primer used was black rattlecan primer, which I applied over all resin parts and the base. But as it would melt styrofoam, I couldn't use it for the dormer or the building's corpus. So I had to mask these areas and use AK's acrylic primer as a third primer and airbrushed it onto the styrofoam parts. Like this I saved me a few hours compared to airbrushing all of it, and could correct some areas the rattlecan primer didn't hit. For the airbrush stage I again started with the base and the vegetation. I base painted the whole vegetation with a dark green tone, which I applied over all plants and grass tufts. I then lightened up the base paint several times and sprayed some highlights into the vegetation, and with every lighter version I only sprayed the more raised areas, keeping the lower areas darker. And with the lightest version I sprayed only the tips of the tufts and plants. Later I will add some variation and write tufts into the brush painting stage. The cobblestones were pre-colored with a light grey color, as it looks like the stones were rather bright in the reference. I applied the paint, not covering them completely but in a cloudy pattern, to make it look irregular and let the black primer show through for some depth. And I made sure that the green overspray from the vegetation was covered. The earthen ground was pre-colored in a darker brown tone first, again in a not completely covering but cloudy pattern. And again with the primer showing through, it looked deeper and maybe slightly moistened, as if the ground was still a bit wet from the last Normandy summer rain. And with covering the green overspray here, the scene looked better immediately and somehow cleaner and sharper. For some variation and not ending up with just one big brown area, I sprayed a lighter brown tone in a flat angle, so it hits the raised areas and parts, and like this, almost like a pre-shading, emphasized the contours of the ground. This also helps to separate the ground into wet and dry parts, as I want to work out this effect more with enamels later, just like the ground is partly wet from the last rain. I then switched to brushes and started with a wash over the cobblestones with a beige paint to give the stones a dusty look and emphasize the joints. The paint was highly diluted here and applied in 2 layers to achieve a good coverage but avoid covering the base paint with one too thick layer. And to work out the raised areas and bring out the texture of the cobblestones, I made several passes with dry brushing. I started with a medium gray tone and then applied several lighter paints which went into a sandy, light earthen direction to get the bright result I saw on the reference I mentioned earlier. To bring some variation into the vegetation, I grabbed me various green acrylic paints and started to paint individual leaves randomly. I here tried to bring some variety into this green area, and by picking out the leaves with different paints, I separated the individual plants optically. And to imply some dried tufts and plants, I used a beige paint and here again painted individual strands, and with that brought more variety and interest into this corner. And these steps were way more fun and relaxing than they might look like. And that's the result, and I could now move on to the groundwork. I herefore switched to enamel paints. I started with applying a darker tone in the deeper and therefore maybe damper spots. The paint was diluted with odorless thinner, so it's not covering the acrylic paints completely, and they could act as a roadmap where to place the darker paint. And with this paint even stronger diluted, I made a wash over the cobblestones to integrate them into the scene optically, as the dust and dirt that accumulates on them should have the same color as the ground next to it. And as a bonus, this gave the cobblestones an additional layer of depth. While the dark paint was still wet, I applied a lighter dry earth tone on the raised and drier areas. By applying it wet in wet, the paint blends itself. And if there are some places where it doesn't happen for whatever reason, a thinner moistened brush can be used to do the blending if needed or wanted. My goal here was to create an unregular look of the ground without creating a specific pattern. And this lighter paint was also applied on the cobblestones, but not as a wash, but here and there randomly to loosen up the look of this area and give it more texture. The darkest paint, wet grounds, was applied into the deepest spots to imply some moisture that didn't dry out yet and to make the ground around the vegetation a bit darker and therefore act as a kind of fake shadows. I tried to not overdo it here, just a few dots here and there for optical interest, and as it will dry out slightly glossy, I had to be careful with the amount of application. This corner should be darker because it will be surrounded by the small walls and the building, so I applied the wet mud paint here too, to imply again fake shadows and maybe some moisture. I then applied this paint as heavy specks, not unloading the brush but directly applying onto the ground. This was supposed to connect the lighter and darker areas visually and make it look more random. This was then also repeated with the lighter dry earth enamels. Only now was I satisfied enough to move on to some acrylic paints. I painted single stones randomly in natural earthen paints like light and dark grays, browns and orangish tones. This helped a lot to bring some variation and texture into the ground. Without this step, I would end up with just a huge brown area, and this helps a lot to loosen up this look. And again, it's not as boring as it looks. Time consuming maybe, but very relaxing and rewarding. Then I grabbed me dark brown enamel paint and with that, diluted with thinner, made a pin wash around the painted stones and the earlier placed seagrass. This emphasized the details and lifted them from the ground optically. I also placed it around the grass and vegetation to simulate the shadows these plants would create. And it also helped to give the ground a damper look. I also applied it onto the stones in the left corner again to increase the shadow effect, and randomly onto the rest, mostly into the deeper spots to emphasize these and the deeper joints. This brought more optical interest into this area, and as this diluted paint gets significantly lighter when it dries, it's hard to overdo it here. And with that, the basic ground painting was done for now, and I could finally jump to painting the building. This was again started with pre-coloring the specific areas with my airbrush, and I used a dark grey for the roof shingles, a yellowish sandy color for the stones of the facade, which I again applied in a cloudy pattern, and a light grey for the plastered areas, also cloudy. This came the closest to the reference picture, which shows a bright facade. The brush painting was started at the roof because I wanted to get this done first before heading to the facade. I used a lighter grey and applied it with the downward motion to highlight only the front edges of the shingles and let the joints remain darker, and like this highlight the texture of the roof and create fake shadows. This was basically a wetter dry brushing, and I repeated this with a stiffer brush I moved into both directions to increase the effect. The reference picture doesn't show much of the roof, so I got me some pictures of shingled roofs and realized that there can be more colors than black, white and greys. So to create a more interesting roof, I took me some freedom and painted single shingles in matching colors. It were mostly brown, sandy, orangish, reddish and light grey paints I used here, and I think they harmonize nicely. I applied the paints glaze-like over the previously applied grey paint, so they varied the color but kept the texture. And I brought some additional variation into the look only by varying the paint-water ratio, making it more or less opaque. As the shingles on the dormer side are supposed to be slate shingles, I painted them in the same way, but kept the glazing colors in a light grey, almost whitish direction, and therefore separated the two materials optically. And it's important to know that these paints will dry out less colorful like they look when wet. To finish the roof, I made a wash with a beige wash to unify the partly bright colors and gave them a dusty, dirty look. And repeated this step with a light grey color to again emphasize the texture of the roof and smoothen it even more optically. The metal sheets on the dormer were base painted with a dark rust paint, and while it was still slightly wet, I added a light rust tone diluted with retarder. This was blended with a brush into the previously applied dark rust tone, and then I let it dry completely. I then tried to recreate the look of old lead sheets and therefore started to apply a light grey paint with a sponge, so the previously applied rust paint was only slightly visible. This process was, like often, about to try and see if it works out. This was then repeated with a light green and a medium grey. I then made a glaze or filter on top of these paints with a light blue paint. This was supposed to give the typical look of decay on old metal surfaces exposed to weather and time. I was happy I could create this effect with acrylic paints only, as they dry faster than enamels I originally wanted to use here. After removing the masking tape, I realized the sheets were too bright. So I made a second filter with a dark grey paint and then was satisfied enough to finally move on to the facade. a part of this building I was looking forward to paint the whole time. I started by painting the single stones randomly with slightly diluted acrylic paints. These paints were the same I used on the roof, but chosen by matching the stones of the original building. Here pictures of the building I took while our Normandy vacation came in very helpful, as the World War II reference picture was black and white. As the joints were just empty spaces, I wanted to fill them, and I here used my favorite stuff for that from Juvela. It is very fine but still has some texture, so the joints would look like actual mortar joints instead of just empty gaps. After placing the grout, I pushed it around and in position with a big, very soft brush. Like this, the joints were filled and the excess material was brushed off and over the edges. The bit material that remained on the stones was welcome because it gave them more texture and the dust already turned down the bright colors. With sand and ballast freeze, I fixed the grout by dripping it directly onto the surface. It flows nicely into the joints and spreads out almost by itself. But it's always a good idea to help the fixer reach every place with a big brush and remove excess in the same step. Because the more fixer is on the model, the more time it takes to dry and it can dry out glossy when overdosed. The reference picture shows rather bright joints, so to highlight them and the newly created texture on the stone's surface, I made a wash over the whole area with a very light grey color. This immediately changed the look of the stones because it turned down the bright colors even more. And to make the facade look more dusty and slightly dirty, I repeated this with a beige sandy color. This also helped to bring the facade's color into the typical Normandy-like beige appearance. With that done, I could paint the plastered areas and I started with base painting them in a light grey, again diluted so it's not covering the pre-coloring completely. The next step was to bring more variation and depth into the surface, so I made a wash with a slightly different, darker tone to emphasize the deeper spots and make these areas look slightly distressed. When this was completely dry, I made a dry brushing with a lighter color, which helped to emphasize the earlier applied texture and raised spots, and slightly broke up the monotone look. Now I could start weathering the plaster, and for that used a diluted dark brown paint, which I applied onto the areas where dirt would accumulate. In the past I used retarder for diluting the paints for jobs like this, but I wanted to avoid the longer drying times here, as this project was already taking me way too long. So I used flow improver this time, which behaves almost equally but dries way faster. Basically I applied the diluted paints, sometimes in streaks where dirty water would run down, and then used a soft brush to blend the paint into the facade and correct the size and shape of the streaks. When the first layer was completely dry, I repeated the previous step to increase the effect and make some areas look more dirty than others. Usually I tend to overdo the weathering because I like the look, but this time I really tried hard to not overdo it, as the building looks rather clean. And I think with this, for me, limited weathering, the result was a bit closer to being realistic. I then repeated the last step with a light green paint to simulate verdigris from the moisture collecting on and around the building. But this time the paint was diluted more than the brown to not overdo it and make it more subtle. To paint the wooden doors and window frames, I wanted to try out a new way, so I again played around. Over a dark brown base paint I applied a lighter beige wood color in the direction wood grain would be grown into these wooden parts. So vertically on the vertical parts and horizontally on the horizontal parts. I did not cover the whole area but applied it in stripes, so to say. I then repeated this step with a second wood color for more variation and placed this second paint into the gaps the first paint left free. I again made sure that this paint isn't covering the whole area and applied it in stripes. With the white paint I tried to recreate the light colored doors and windows I saw on the reference. And for that I grabbed me a soft and white brush and, like a wetter dry brushing, applied the paint by swiping the brush in the direction of the previously painted wood grain. The paint wasn't supposed to cover the grain completely but gives the impression of old worn out paint. And to make the white doors look less new and shiny, I grabbed me the dark brown paint and, just like on the plaster, applied it thin over the doors and increased the effect in corners where dirt should accumulate. And this was also done with the bright green for verdigris, so the doors integrate nicely into the dirty facade. And I have to say I like the result of this playing around a lot. And because I was really satisfied with how the doors came out, I repeated the steps on the cafe sign, but instead of the white applied the needed red paint on top of it. I here again applied the red paint into the direction of the wood grain and highlighted the frame with a brighter red paint. Then the letters were quickly painted, and here the raised letters from the print were very helpful, so I was convinced that printing the sign was the right decision. And again with the dark brown paint I weathered the letters to make them less shiny. With the facade painted I could finally add the window glass, the reason I wanted to keep it removable. I therefore cut pieces from transparent plastic packaging in the needed sizes and marked the positions of the openings and the frames. With my hobby knife I added cracks which I carved into the backside of the plastic glass. The reference shows broken glass, but I wanted to keep it in one piece as I have no room to be shown behind the glass and I needed the glass to cover that. And after that I could glue them in place. Because super clean glass would look weird, I used real earth and fixed it with a drop of sand and ballast I brushed this mix over the very smooth glass and like this made the glass look dusty and dirty. And this also helped to emphasize the cracks because the dirt collected in them. The dirt in the gutter I hit the supporting wood pieces with needed to be painted too, so I used the enamels I used for the base's ground and with that adapted the dirt visually to the rest of the scene by blending them into each other. Now with the windows and the gutter done, I could finally glue the building in place and enjoy how it harmonized with the base for the first time. I also quickly added the small walls by gluing them in place, which were painted in the same way like the plastered areas on the building. Of course, I now had to close the gaps with the Bergswerk spatula and sand it smooth. And like I said earlier, it's good it's the backside and rarely visible later. Because the ground and the building weren't perfectly straight, I had to level the building to the ground so it's not floating. For that I again placed some real earth and seagrass and pushed it in place with a soft brush. And again the VMS stuff was used to fix everything in place. And obviously the earth had to be adapted to the rest, so I again used the enamels from the groundwork, blended them into each other, and with that had the building integrated into the scene. With the darkest paint wet ground, I darkened the area where the water would flow out of the gutter, because the ground should be dirty and maybe slightly wet here from the last rain and dirt flushed from the roof. And I also used it to set some shadows in front of the building. And again with the green moss enamels I here 2 added verdigris and maybe algae from the pooling water. Then came one of my favorite techniques from the one and only uncle, adding moss. I added blobs of wood glue with a brush randomly and varying the sizes and shapes to make it look like it grew irregular. I then sprinkled Woodland Scenics fine turf on top of it and gently pushed it into the wood glue with a soft brush for better adhesion. And by turning it upside down, removed the excess, which can be supported by an airbrush. Although it's looking pretty nice already, I wanted to paint it to integrate it into the scene and avoid an unnatural look. I started with strongly diluted dark brown, which I gave into the turf by touching it with a brush. The turf soaked up the diluted paint like a sponge, so it's not going anywhere. Next I touched the turf with the brush holding diluted khaki paint, so it flew into the still wet dark brown paint, leaving the edges dark. If I was looking for old and slightly drier moss, I could stop right here. But as my scene is set in wet Normandy, I wanted some vivid juicy moss, so I added diluted bright green paint into the khaki paint, which was also still wet. The paint didn't mix but created colored rings, making the moss juicy in the center and right on the edges. On bigger areas, like the roof, I worked in sections, so I was sure the first paint was still wet and didn't dry when I applied the last paint. And when looking at this comparison, I think it's definitely worth making this effort. Next I added bright green with speckling to create the impression of lichen and very small moss blobs. What I then repeated with deck tan for lighter lichen and some bird drops, what gave the whole roof some more texture. With the building basically done, I could quickly paint the tree I made earlier. I started with a light grey dry brushing over a dark brown base paint, and this brought out the texture of the bark nicely. This was followed by a wash with diluted dark brown to emphasize the deeper spots and highlight the bark texture more. And then I finished it with diluted green paint here and there for verdigris and moss. I then added the leaves using foliage by Heki, where I removed the leaves from the mat they came on. The tree's small branches were then sprayed with hairspray to make them sticky, and I sprinkled the leaves over them from all directions and angles to get a good coverage and a nice vivid tree. This was repeated until I was satisfied with the look of the tree. And then finished with a good coverage of hairspray so the leaves stay where they are, and then put it away to dry completely. Because the foliage had a plastic-like green look, I grabbed me my airbrush and applied a dark green over the leaves. I tried to be very precise here and not to spray the branches. A more accurate way would probably be using a brush here, but to be honest, after this long project I was too lazy to paint every single leaf by hand. And then I could glue it in place. To spice up the vegetation and add more interest, I added plants in different sizes and colors by supergluing them in place. I here used plants from diorama manufacturers and dried plants from my garden which match in size and shape. and sometimes combined them both, and I think the result is looking very convincing. Then came the finishing touches, and I started with painting the whole frame with undiluted Tamiya black for a nice clean look. I prefer black frames over the ones with wooden look because they don't distract from the diorama and improve the impression of the scene being cut out of reality. But that's just my 2 cents. I designed and printed this sign, which I then painted and glued to the frame. It's a nice additional detail and gives the scene a name and shows the interested viewer where it's taking place. And to show where my inspiration came from and that it's not a fictional scene, I glued a version of the reference picture next to it. And a picture of me standing in front of this building while our Normandy vacation in 2023. The birth hour of the idea to this build. Only thing left to do was placing the figures I painted in the last video, and after I played around with potential positions a bit, I started to glue them in place using superglue. I here for the first time saw the figures and the diorama together and immediately noticed how well they harmonize together. To avoid floating figures and level them to the ground, I placed a small amount of real earth around the boots and pushed it in place with a soft brush. This unfortunately could not be done with the guys standing on the cobblestones, so I had to find a good matching spot where they didn't float. And with a drop or two of the VMS fixer I fixed the earth in place, and as a bonus this also helps to secure the figure to the ground even stronger. As the last and final step, I had to blend the earth into the ground with the enamels I used on the ground earlier, and believe it or not, this build is done. When you are still here, thank you very much for watching and your patience. I am super happy with the result, and maybe this turned out to be my masterpiece. So far the figures are the best I painted and the diorama is the best I made. So it's a perfect match combined in this build. The building and the scene is recognizable, the weathering came out nice and the vegetation is looking natural to me. I think my experience from all the last projects came together in this one. I love it when an implemented idea is standing on my table in front of me, and I will now enjoy looking at it for some time. So, enough talking from me. If you like what you saw, please consider supporting me by subscribing, and I would love to read your feedback in the comments. So long, thanks again, and until the next time.